under the scorching midday sun on a deserted road in Oak Ridge. A white millionaire was rushing to an important project meeting when his luxury car suddenly broke down in the middle of the road. Frustrated and helpless, he tried to fix it himself, but the heat from the engine made him cough violently. Just as he was about to give up, a black woman appeared out of nowhere and offered to help. Within minutes, the car was running again to his surprise. But then, as the sunlight caught the ring on her finger, he froze because he recognized that ring. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The sun over Oak Ridge was unforgiving that day, hanging in the sky like a burning coin, turning the two-lane back road into a skillet. The air shimmered with heat waves, the kind that made even the wind stay still. Nothing moved, not a bird, not a squirrel, not even a fly daring to buzz through the thick southern air. In the middle of that nowhere stretch, a sleek black Tesla Model S sat still like a stranded alien ship, its hood slightly ajar, faint wisps of steam curling out from beneath it like the last breaths of a dying thing. Jordan Brooks stood beside it, expensive leather shoes crunching lightly on the gravel, his white dress shirt plastered to his back with sweat sleeves rolled up in a way that felt more like surrender than practicality. His tie hung loose and his patience hung by an even thinner thread. He checked his Rolex again, 11:43 a.m. In exactly 17 minutes, he was supposed to be standing inside a cooled conference hall with floor-to-ceiling glass, pitching the Cedar Hill Innovation Complex to a boardroom full of powerful investors. Not here. Not melting beside his car on a forgotten road outside a town he hadn't thought about in over 20 years. He sighed deep and sharp, looking out across the flat, dusty horizon, wondering how a billion-dollar company could still let its CEO end up without cell signal in the middle of nowhere. His Tesla had been purring fine this morning, but an hour into the drive, a light blinked on the dashboard, something about coolant temperature. He ignored it. The meeting mattered more. Now, here he was, watching white vapor spit and curl out like ghosts from the open hood. He popped the frunk, took one look inside, and instantly regretted it. Steam blasted up with a hiss, fogging his sunglasses. He staggered back, coughing, waving a hand through the mist. The irony gnawed at him. He could speak fluent code, could explain blockchain integration to investors in under 5 minutes, but couldn't name a single component inside the engine of his own car. A gust of hot air blew past. He rolled his eyes, ran a hand through his slicked-back blonde hair, and glanced again at his phone. Still no signal. The status bar glared at him like an insult. Then from the distance came the sound of a sputtering engine. Not smooth or efficient like his Tesla, this sound was raw mechanical coughing, like an old man clearing his throat. Jordan turned, shielding his eyes. A faded red pickup truck was crawling toward him, the kind of truck that had seen too many summers and not enough oil changes. It pulled over a few yards behind him. The engine clunked as it shut off. For a moment, Jordan felt a strange sense of relief. Help maybe followed immediately by skepticism. The driver's door creaked open and a woman stepped out. She didn't look like help, at least not the kind he was used to. She wore faded jeans stained with greasework boots scuffed at the toes, and a sleeveless plaid shirt rolled up to her elbows. Her dark skin gleamed under the sun, her curly hair pulled back into a practical bun. No makeup, no badge, no clipboard, just calm, capable energy. She walked toward him, steady and unhurried. "Looks like you're having a rough morning," she said, not smiling, not judging, just observing. Jordan squinted at her through the heat haze. Her voice was calm, grounded, the kind of voice that didn't ask for attention, but somehow held it anyway. He managed a half smirk. "You could say that." "Engine overheating?" she asked, already circling toward the car without waiting for permission, hands already pulling a pair of work gloves from her back pocket. Apparently, he muttered, "Supposed to be at a major presentation in Oak Ridge in 15 minutes. She paused, just for a heartbeat. "Cedar Hill?" she asked, glancing sideways at him. He blinked. "Yeah, you've heard of it. I've heard enough," she replied simply, then leaned into the open hood with the confidence of someone who didn't need to prove she belonged there. Jordan frowned slightly. There was something disorienting about this moment. The Tesla was a precision machine, silent, clean, cutting edge. And she looked like someone who belonged under a '78 Ford, not fiddling with a smart EV on the side of a sun-baked road. "You've been ignoring your maintenance alerts," she said flatly, already adjusting something near the coolant tank. "System's been warning you for a while." "I've been busy," he said, trying not to sound defensive. Running a company. The sound again. Not amused, not dismissive, just neutral. Maybe a little tired. She pulled out a multi-tool from her back pocket and twisted something with precision, her hands moving in sharp, efficient lines. No hesitation. Still, he watched her warily. His corporate instincts kicked in. High-risk roadside assistance. Unknown variables. Small town. No ID. No certification. And she hadn't even asked before touching the car. "You sure you know what you're doing?" he asked, a little too sharp, the edge of control creeping back into his voice. She didn't look up. "You sure you want to keep standing in the sun while I prove it?" Jordan opened his mouth, then shut it. He didn't like being out of his depth, and something about the way she hadn't flinched, hadn't even cared who he was, threw him off balance. Most people either deferred or performed. She did neither. After a minute, she stepped back, wiped her hands on a cloth that had seen better years, and let the hood fall closed with a solid thunk. "Temporary fix," she said. "Should get you to town. But if you keep pushing it like this, you'll fry the whole system. And Tesla or not, that's going to cost more than just money." Jordan folded his arms. "You're a mechanic, third generation," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "I run Iron Hope Auto 10 miles that way." She gestured loosely behind her. "Just past the bend, big blue sign. Most folks miss it." He looked her over again this time, more carefully. She didn't wear a name tag. No logo on her shirt. Her boots were oil-worn and sturdy. Her jeans had holes, not for fashion, but from years of kneeling in gravel. She didn't look corporate. She looked real. Still, the doubt lingered. "Iron Hope," he repeated. "Can't say I've heard of it." She gave a dry half-smile. "You would have had to be looking for something that ain't advertised." Then, more pointedly, "which most people like you don't." Jordan flinched just slightly. It wasn't the first time someone had read him with such unnerving accuracy, but it was the first time in years it felt earned. She turned to go. "Keep an eye on your coolant level and your ego." He blinked. "Excuse me." She tossed the line over her shoulder like it cost her nothing. "You're not the first man to assume a wrench in my hand means I don't know what I'm doing. But I've pulled engines out with my bare arms while those suits you wear were still getting pressed in Manhattan." Jordan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a few bills, too much probably, but something about her made him want to overcorrect. "Thank you. Really." She took the money with no fuss, no hesitation, just pocketed it and offered a faint nod. But as she turned to climb back into her truck, a flicker of silver caught the sun, a ring on her finger, delicate and unmistakable. And just like that, the air shifted. She accepted the money. As she did, he caught a glimpse of something on her finger. A ring. Silver aged with a delicate blue sapphire set in the center. It shimmered in the sunlight, so small but unmistakable. His breath hitched. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice tighter than he meant. She froze, then instinctively closed her fingers around it. "It was my mother's," she said, eyes narrowing. Why Jordan couldn't speak. His mind was spinning. The ring wasn't just familiar. It was exact. The same antique sapphire ring his mother used to wear, the one he hadn't seen since he was a child. The one she gave to him in the orphanage, whispering, "Keep this close. It'll remind you where you come from." And he had, for a time, until he met a little girl in that very orphanage, brown-skinned, big-eyed, alone, and gave it to her in secret as a promise. "I'll come back for you." That was over 20 years ago. A promise made under a tree at St. Arlen's orphan home. A promise never kept. He looked at the woman again. Her eyes held something he couldn't name, guarded recognition perhaps. But there was no sign she knew who he was. Or maybe she did and simply didn't care. "If it acts up again," she said, walking back to her truck. "Iron Hope's the first left after the Oak Ridge city limit. Big blue sign, hard to miss." He wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. "You've got a meeting to get to Mr. Brooks," she said flatly. "Wouldn't want to keep them waiting." Her truck roared to life like a defiant beast, spitting dust as she pulled away. Jordan stood beside his car, the sun baking into his skin, heart pounding like a drum. He climbed back into the Tesla, but didn't start it. His hand lingered on the steering wheel. The ring, the girl, the tree, the orphanage. He hadn't thought of any of it in years. But now it crashed over him like a wave. The air in Oak Ridge carried a strange weight, like memory baked into sunlight. But Jordan barely noticed it. His eyes were on the clock, his mind locked onto the upcoming pitch. After the quick fix from the roadside mechanic, The Tesla ran smooth well enough at least. He arrived at the Cedar Hill presentation with 2 minutes to spare, just enough time to wipe sweat from his brow, adjust his collar, and slip back into the armor of polished professionalism. Inside the glass-walled conference room, the AC was a blessing, and the silence was thick with anticipation. Investors sat in a clean semicircle, brows raised, pens ready. His father, Ernest Brooks, stood near the back, arms crossed, face unreadable. Jordan stepped up, cleared his throat, and launched in. His voice was firm, steady, practiced. He outlined projections, timelines, market integration. The digital renderings of the Cedar Hill Innovation Complex glowed behind him like a promise of prosperity. When he finished, the room was still. Then came the nods, the murmurs of approval. His father gave one tight smile, the kind that meant respect, not affection, and clapped a hand on his shoulder afterward. "Well done," Ernest said, low and proud. "You showed them you're ready." Jordan nodded the praise, hitting its mark, but not quite sinking in. They shook hands, posed for a photo in front of the project render, and parted ways as the next speaker prepared to take the floor. Ernest stayed behind for a follow-up meeting. Jordan slipped out early, citing a full inbox, but really, he just needed air. He walked through the glass doors into the late morning sun, breathing in the heat like someone searching for balance. He should have felt victorious. He had delivered. The Cedar Hill project, the future of the town, the company, maybe even his legacy, was moving forward. But something itched at the edge of his thoughts. As he drove slowly back into the center of Oak Ridge, past low brick buildings and time-worn porches, he felt the strangest sensation crawling up his spine. Not dread, not nostalgia exactly, but something in between. A whisper, a familiarity he couldn't quite place. The main road was lined with old oak trees, whose roots pushed against cracked sidewalks. Everything felt smaller than it should have, not just physically, but emotionally, like a dream he'd forgotten but never really let go of. Back at the hotel, he should have been practicing, reviewing his notes, checking his schedule, but instead, he sat at the edge of the bed, his laptop open, fingers frozen above the keyboard. He typed in St. Arlen's Children's Home without even thinking. And now he stared at faded images of the facility, a red brick building, a rusting swing set, a crooked sign above the entryway that hadn't changed in decades. He didn't know why he remembered it now, or why it mattered, but it did. Something inside him whispered that it was the place, the beginning of something he couldn't quite name. He closed his eyes and let himself slip backward. He was 5 again, small for his age, too quiet, too pale for the other boys. The tricycle was always broken, the sandbox always half empty. The kids played in loud packs, but he stayed to himself until one day a girl came over and sat beside him. She didn't say a word, just watched the ants crawl over the pavement. She had dark skin, wide eyes, and her hair was tied in 2 little puffed buns on either side of her head. She was younger, maybe 3 or 4, always clutching a torn cloth rabbit. Some kids teased her, called her names. But Jordan Joey, back then the name the staff had given him, offered her half of his peanut butter sandwich and a quiet corner of the yard where no one bothered them. Day after day, they sat beneath the old elm tree, drawing shapes in the dirt, sharing crumbs and quiet. He remembered the last afternoon before he left the home. They told him a family was coming. Important people. They gave him a new shirt, combed his hair. But his stomach was in knots. The girl had come to their usual spot by the tree, clutching her rabbit. Her eyes looked afraid, like she knew something was ending. Joey Jordan had reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver ring his real mother had given him. A small, delicate thing with a blue stone that shimmered in sunlight. He didn't know why he had it, still only that it felt wrong to keep it. So he slipped it into her tiny hand. "This was from someone who loved me," he'd whispered. "Now it's for you. I'll come back. I promise." But he never did. Now, 20 years later, he sat in a hotel room barely 3 miles from that tree, remembering the warmth of her fingers, the certainty in his young voice, the way time eroded the promises of children. He clenched his fists, then looked down at his palms. They were trembling. Across town, in the back room of Iron Hope, Otto Imani sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor beside an open toolbox. The shop had long since gone quiet. Xavier had gone home for the evening, and the only sound was the soft ticking of the cooling engine overhead and the hum of the single hanging bulb swaying gently in the draft. Its light cast slow-moving shadows along the walls, as if the room itself remembered more than it let on. In her hand she held the ring, silver, slim with a blue sapphire, that always caught the light in a way that made it feel like it was trying to speak. She rolled it slowly between her fingers, feeling its weight, not just the metal, but the memory it carried. She had worn it for as long as she could remember. Not because someone told her to, not because she was told what it meant, but because from the moment it touched her skin, it had felt right, necessary, like something meant to fill a hole no one else could see. She didn't know the name of the boy who gave it to her, just his quiet way, his pale hair and small hands, his whisper beneath the old elm tree behind the orphanage. She remembered how he slipped the ring into her palm and said it was from someone who had loved him once, and now it was for her. She had asked him why. He'd only said, "So you don't forget." And she hadn't. She wore the ring through every foster home, every hospital visit, every long night, wondering who she was and where she came from, not because she knew, but because the ring gave her something to hold on to, something hers. Years later, digging through one of Xavier's old file boxes in the attic, she had found a photograph, unlabeled, folded at the corner, brittle with age. It showed a woman standing in front of a porch. The details were hard to make out. The picture had faded. The light had been bad, but on the woman's hand was a ring. Silver, small, blue stone in the center. She hadn't needed confirmation. Something inside her just knew. That was her mother. She kept the photo tucked in a book no one ever borrowed. She never showed Xavier, never asked, because even if it wasn't true, it had to be. The ring had to mean something. The boy had to have known something. And even if it was all just a child's fairy tale, it was the only story she had. Now, as she sat in the stillness of the garage, the memory of the boy had returned. Because earlier today, a man grown successful, polished in a way that life had never allowed her to be, had looked at the ring like it had punched a hole straight through his chest. Jordan Brooks. That was his name now. But something in the set of his eyes, the quiet way he'd hesitated, felt too close to forget. She'd never told anyone. Not even Xavier, because deep down, even before today, she had always felt it, that the ring and the bird belonged to the same story, that she wasn't just forgotten, that someone had once promised to come back. And now maybe he finally had. She stood up slowly, pocketed both items, and walked out into the night. The street was still empty, just the whine of cicadas and the creak of wind through trees. Her heart felt too big in her chest. Back in his room, Jordan scrolled through digital archives, property records, old newspaper clippings. A name kept surfacing: Ava Reed, a woman who once owned a piece of land just outside Oak Ridge. A woman whose name vanished after a suspicious court ruling transferred ownership to the Brooks family 2 decades ago. He clicked on an old photo in the article. There she was, a young woman with dark skin holding a baby in her arms. On her finger, unmistakably, the sapphire ring. Jordan leaned back, eyes wide. He felt the edges of his world bending. That woman, she looked like someone. Not Imani, but like the girl from the tree. And suddenly, he knew. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to understand that the past wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for him to come back. The next morning, he didn't dress for a boardroom. No tie, no polished shoes, just jeans, a plain shirt, and the truth starting to burn a hole in his chest. He had questions. And he was done pretending he didn't care about the answers. The sun was gentler that morning, filtered through a thin layer of clouds that softened the world just enough to make it bearable. Jordan stood outside Iron Hope Auto with the small wooden bird in his hand. He'd polished it the night before, careful not to erase the grooves made by tiny, uncertain fingers. It was still lopsided, a little rough, but something about it had survived, just like the promise it once carried. He stared at the door, wondering if walking through it would reopen wounds or offer the answers he was beginning to need more than clarity itself. Then, without a word, he stepped inside. The shop smelled of machine oil and aged metal, familiar and grounding. Imani was under the hood of a beat-up sedan, arms buried in its guts, humming something soft and unrecognizable. She didn't look up when the bell over the door jingled. He waited. When she finally emerged, wiping her hands on a faded red rag, her eyes met his without surprise. It was as if she'd known he would return. "I brought something," he said, his voice low. She said nothing, her expression unreadable. He held out the bird, resting it gently on the counter between them. Imani stared at it. For a moment, the world narrowed into silence. She reached out slowly, as though touching it would bring everything back at once. Her thumb grazed the curve of its wing. "You kept it," she whispered. Jordan nodded. "So did you." Her eyes flicked to the ring on her hand. She said nothing, but the silence between them changed. It deepened. "I was 5, he said carefully, maybe 6. I didn't even know my last name back then. They called me Joey." Imani's hand stopped moving. "There was this tree in the yard. Big. Elm, I think. You used to bring that old rabbit with the ear torn off." "I remember," she said quietly. "You gave me this." He continued nodding toward the bird. "And I gave you the ring." She looked down at her hand at the delicate silver band that had rested on her finger since before she could read. "You said it was from someone who loved you." "It was. My mother. She gave it to me before I was taken." The words hung heavy, and for the first time Imani's face shifted. Not fear, not anger, just the slow, dawning recognition that the pieces were beginning to align in ways neither of them could explain. Imani stepped back slightly, the distance more emotional than physical. Her thoughts swirled too fast to hold. That boy, the one who had been kind to her when others weren't, who had shared crumbs and carved her something with shaking hands, was now standing in front of her, a man wearing the same shadows in his eyes. He was real, and he remembered, but still a question burned. In the stillness of her small apartment that night after Jordan had left, Imani sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers tracing the outline of the wooden bird. She turned the ring on her finger with her thumb, her mind racing. He looked at the bird like he remembered carving it, like he remembered me. But how could that be? Joey was a quiet boy in a broken place. Jordan Brooks is a CEO with glass towers behind him. Still, when he saw the ring, something shifted in him and in me. Could it be, could the boy my mother lost be the man standing right in front of me? Across town, Jordan sat at the desk in his hotel room, the lamp casting a yellow halo over a growing pile of documents. He wasn't ready to sleep. He wasn't even sure he could. Instead, he scrolled through digitized records of orphanages, family court hearings, and property transfers. Then he saw it. A court document dated 20 years ago. A custody revocation for Ava Reed, a child listed only as Joey, transferred to foster care pending adoption by approved benefactors. His hands froze. He clicked through. The signatures were there. Ernest Brooks, legal guardian. Petition granted. Jordan leaned back in his chair. His pulse thundered in his ears. The past wasn't just coming back. It had been waiting all along, tucked inside files, hidden behind lies. He stood slowly, walked to the mirror, and looked at his reflection. The face was the same, but something beneath the skin had shifted. He didn't know exactly what he was to Imani, but something inside him whispered the answer. He just needed proof. The next morning, they met again, this time not at the shop, but on neutral ground, an old park bench near the edge of town. The elm tree was still there, gnarled and weathered, but standing. Imani arrived first. She didn't sit right away. Jordan came a few minutes later holding a file folder in one hand. "I think I found something," he said simply. Imani studied his face, then slowly sat. He handed her the folder. Inside were copies of documents, court papers, photos, a grainy picture of a boy with pale hair and solemn eyes labeled Joey, St. Arlen's home. She held the picture in her lap for a long time. "My name was never really Brooks," Jordan said quietly. "Not at the start. That was given to me. Just like the company. The title. All of it." Imani looked up. I think we were both taken from the same woman," he said, "and given 2 very different lives." The wind moved gently through the leaves above them. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was sacred. She nodded slowly, her eyes stinging. "Then let's find out the rest. Together." He exhaled, the sound more like relief than breath. And for the first time, they weren't just 2 strangers haunted by a ring. They were survivors of the same story, walking toward the truth hand in hand. It began with a name. Not a full story, not a revelation, just a name scribbled in faded ink on the corner of a land record, Ava Reed. Jordan stared at the fragile piece of paper in the Oak Ridge Town Archive, his fingers tracing over the loop of the R, like it might unlock something. The document was brittle yellowed with time, the ink uneven, and rushed as if someone had tried to make it disappear, but failed to finish the job. Next to Ava's name was a date 2 decades old and a handwritten note transferred under emergency order. Capacity revoked. There was no medical certification, no legal judgment, no follow-up documents. Just a line that turned ownership of 38 acres of freshwater-rich land over to Brooks Development. And at the bottom, in unmistakable black pen, was the signature of Ernest Brooks. Jordan folded the document with deliberate care, heart hammering against his ribs. Outside the courthouse, the sun was too bright. The light felt harsh, now accusatory, as though even the air knew he'd just seen something he wasn't meant to find. He sat in his car and didn't start it. His hands were shaking again. That name, Ava Reed, the woman from the photo, the ring, the baby in her arms, the land they were building Cedar Hill on. It was all connected. He just didn't know how deep it went yet. Across town, Imani pulled an old box from beneath the floorboards of her childhood bedroom where Xavier kept things too painful to throw away. The box smelled of cedar and dust. Inside were letters, torn pages, a photograph of a woman with gentle eyes, eyes like hers. She sifted through the contents until she found what she didn't know she was looking for: a faded copy of a death certificate. Ava Reed, cause unknown, status deceased, date blank, doctor's name illegible. Her breath caught. It wasn't just the sloppiness of the document, it was the absurdity of it. Her mother was alive. She pulled out another item, half a letter unfinished in her mother's handwriting. It was addressed to no one. Just began, "They took him from me. I didn't even get to see his face. Tell him if you ever find him, he was loved." That night at Iron Hope, the shop was quiet, but not still. Jordan stood by the workbench, papers in hand. Imani walked in through the side door, carrying her own stack of brittle evidence. They didn't speak right away. The hum of the overhead light filled the space between them. Then silently they laid their papers down side by side. Property transfer, death certificate, court filing, handwritten letter. It was like watching puzzle pieces slide into place. Same date range, same names, same land, same loss. Jordan looked at Imani. "They took something from both of us," he said, "and they buried it under concrete." Imani's voice was low. "They didn't just take something. They took someone." There was a long silence. Jordan sat down on the edge of the table. "My adoption papers say my biological background is sealed, that there were no living relatives, but someone had to give me up. I never asked why. I never questioned the story my father gave me. Maybe I didn't want to." Imani nodded slowly. "Xavier told me I had a mother, that she fought to keep me, but lost. He never mentioned a brother." Jordan's breath stilled. "You think it could be me?" Imani didn't answer. Not with words, just opened her palm. In it was the wooden bird, the one he carved, the one she kept. "You gave me this. You don't remember giving it to a stranger." Jordan stared at it, at the way the wings were shaped, the crooked tail. His hands had made that. Small hands, uncertain but determined. "I called myself Joey," he whispered. Her eyes were wet. "I called you my friend." Jordan stood. "I need to know for sure." She nodded. "Me too." The next morning, he called in a favor from an old contact in legal affairs, someone who could discreetly access sealed adoption records. In return, he offered the promise of inside access to a deal that might never exist. Meanwhile, Imani drove to Xavier's place, an old wooden house on the edge of town past the river bend. Xavier opened the door with tired eyes. He didn't speak, just moved aside to let her in. The air smelled like coffee and old varnish. Imani sat down on the worn sofa ring, visible voice steady. "Did Mama have a son before me?" Xavier sat across from her, hands clasped between his knees. For a moment he didn't breathe. Then slowly he nodded. "She did." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because it was dangerous. Because I didn't know if he survived. Because the people who took him had more power than anyone I could fight." "Do you know where he went?" "No. Only that he was renamed, erased, given to someone rich, and that your mother never forgave herself." Imani leaned back the room, spinning gently around her. "His name was Jordan," she whispered. Xavier didn't blink. Then she was right all along. Later that night, Jordan stood in his hotel room, watching the screen refresh. A notification dinged. His contact had found something, a partial birth record altered, but still legible beneath the redacted ink. Born to Ava Reed. Male. Date matched his own birthday. Location, Oak Ridge. The screen blurred as he blinked. He reached for the nightstand, pulled out the small wooden bird, and closed his hand around it. It no longer felt like a keepsake. It felt like a compass. They were getting closer to the truth. And truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. The sun had long dipped behind the hills when Jordan returned to the garage. The lot was empty, quiet, bathed in the kind of dusky glow that softened even the harshest truths. Imani was already there, seated at a weathered table inside a small lamp, casting a cone of light over stacks of papers, old photographs, yellowed letters, and two small artifacts that meant the world to both of them: the carved wooden bird, and the silver ring. Neither of them spoke right away. They simply stared down at the table at the pieces of a past they never knew belonged to them both. Jordan reached into his bag and pulled out a manila envelope. He opened it slowly and slid the contents across the table. Property transfer records, court documents. One in particular caught Imani's eye. An order granting custody of a child named Joey Reed to a guardian affiliated with Ernest Brooks, dated 21 years ago. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. "I found it in the Oak Ridge Municipal Archive," Jordan said, his voice low, steady. "They changed my name, scrubbed everything. Even the date of birth was shifted by 3 months. But that name, Joey, was mine." Imani nodded, lips pressed tight. She reached for a creased letter she had carried with her since she was 12. One she'd never shown anyone. It was addressed simply, "To my children, if you ever find each other." The handwriting was careful, shaky. She laid it beside the records. "My mother wrote this. She was trying to reach us long before we even knew we needed to be found." Jordan stared at the letter, at the familiar loops of the script. Her name was Ava. Ava Reed. "She's my mother too, isn't she?" Imani looked up, her eyes glassy. "Yes." There was a pause that seemed to stretch into something sacred, a space where everything false could fall away. "I had a DNA test done," Jordan continued. "I submitted my sample 3 days ago after I found the Reed file. Results came in this morning." He pulled out his phone, unlocked it, turned the screen toward her. The screen displayed a simple result: siblings, full match. Probability 99.9%. Imani didn't gasp, didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes as if she had known all along but never allowed herself to believe it. When she opened them again, she met his gaze fully. Not as strangers, not as mechanic and executive, but as something ancient, as something whole. "I used to dream about a brother," she said quietly. "When I was little, after the orphanage, I'd sit on the floor in my room and make up stories. That he got adopted by a kind family, that he lived by the water, that he'd find me one day." Jordan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And I used to carve birds, for someone I couldn't name. I never knew why, but I felt like I left something behind. Someone." Outside, the wind shifted. The branches tapped softly against the workshop's roof. The night had deepened, but neither of them moved. This wasn't a moment to rush. It had waited over 20 years to happen. "I have to ask," Jordan said after a while. "We don't look alike. People will ask. I've asked myself." Imani nodded. "I wondered too. For years." Just then, Xavier entered through the back door. He carried a box in his hands, old and wooden, sealed with a strip of linen. He placed it gently on the table, his eyes scanning the two of them like a man looking at ghosts turned real. "I suppose it's time," he said, opening the box. Inside were photographs, hospital bracelets, a faded envelope marked Private AR, and a folded piece of paper titled Birth Notes. "She wrote this before the clinic took her away," Xavier said. "Your mother." He handed the note to Imani, who opened it carefully. It read, "Imani was born in light. Her father Samuel was the calm before every storm in my life. He gave her her strength. Jordan came from a colder place. His father was white, and the world judged us for that. I never regretted loving either of them. I only regret letting the world tear us apart." Jordan read over her shoulder. A silence fell again, deeper this time. They were different. But they were siblings, whole, real, and connected by something no one else could define or deny. "What happened to her?" Jordan asked. "Why didn't she ever come for us?" Xavier exhaled a slow breath full of memory and pain. "Because she was taken. After the second baby, after you, Ernest Brooks wanted the land she owned. He saw the water rights the location. He used his influence to have her declared unfit, claimed postpartum psychosis. She was locked away in a private facility off the books. They told her both her children were dead, and then they sold your birth certificate. You became his son." Jordan leaned forward, hands braced against the table. "He adopted me to cover up the theft." Xavier nodded. "That, and because his wife had lost their real child during labor. He needed a replacement, a child with no ties. You were convenient, quiet, smart, and you fit the image." Imani's voice shook. "And they let you rot," Xavier said simply. "You were too young, too poor, too black to matter. I found you before the system could." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "And Mama, she's alive," Xavier said, "and I know where she is." Jordan and Imani turned to him in unison, stunned. "She's in a wellness estate registered under a different name, far enough from here to stay hidden, close enough to reach by morning." The siblings looked at each other. A quiet determination passed between them. Jordan stood. "Then we go together." Imani reached out, took his hand. Together. Outside, the first light of morning began to edge across the horizon, and for the first time in 2 decades, brother and sister stood not in the shadow of a lie, but in the dawn of truth. The city skyline shimmered under a pale morning sun as Jordan stood silently in front of the towering glass facade of the Brooks Global headquarters. Behind him, Ava and Imani waited their presence, composed, their purpose resolute. The time for quiet reconciliation had passed. Now came the confrontation. The truth, sharpened over decades of silence, was ready to be spoken aloud. No longer a whisper in hidden rooms or buried documents, it would echo through these marble halls and shatter the legacy built on its suppression. Inside, Ernest Brooks was already seated at the boardroom table, flanked by executives in tailored suits, their eyes cold and curious. They had been summoned under the guise of a private briefing for the final approval of the Cedar Hill project, but Jordan had rewritten the agenda. As the elevator doors opened and he stepped out, the room quieted. Imani followed at his side, and then Ava entered, a quiet force wrapped in memory and fire. Ernest stood. "Jordan, what is this? Who are these?" Jordan raised a hand. "Before you speak, before you lie again, you'll listen." He moved to the head of the table, not to take the seat, but to stand before it, hands braced on the cold wood. Imani remained at his right, Ava just behind each of them, aligned like pieces of a truth long withheld. "I'm not here to celebrate a project," Jordan began, voice steady. "I'm here to dismantle a legacy. Your legacy." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Ernest's expression didn't flinch. 25 years ago, Jordan continued, a woman named Ava Reed owned the land this company now claims as its crown jewel. She refused to sell. She was labeled unstable. Her child, me, was taken. Her second child, my sister, was hidden to keep her safe. This woman, he said, gesturing toward Ava, was stripped of everything. And you made sure of it. Ernest's mouth tensed. "You're being emotional. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Jordan snapped. "You forged court documents. You buried medical records. You adopted me under a false name after declaring my mother dead. And you built this empire on land you stole with a lie." Gasps rippled quietly. Ava stepped forward, now eyes locked on Ernest. "I was not insane," she said, her voice controlled but fierce. "I was grieving. You had me medicated until I forgot how to scream. You took my children, but you didn't erase me." Ernest's gaze darted to the board, gauging their reactions. "This is a ploy, an emotional stunt. Then explain this," Imani said sharply, pulling a folder from her coat. She opened it and laid out copies, DNA results confirming sibling match land deeds with Ava's signature and forged amendments, birth records, adoption files with mismatched timelines. Ernest reached for one of the documents but stopped himself. Jordan leaned forward. "You knew all this time. You raised me to replace the son your wife lost. You used my name to launder your guilt. You paraded me in front of shareholders like a trophy of succession. But I was never yours." A long silence followed. The board didn't speak. Even the city beyond the windows seemed to hold its breath. Then Ernest finally spoke, low and bitter. "You were nothing when we found you. She was nobody. You have all of this because of me." Ava's jaw tightened. "He has strength in spite of you, not because of you." Ernest's voice rose. "You want to destroy everything I've built. I want the truth to stand where your lies used to," Jordan said. He turned toward the board. "Effective immediately, I'm resigning from my role. I'm transferring all holdings connected to Cedar Hill back to the Reed family. And I'm cooperating with a federal investigation into how that land was acquired." A hush fell. Then murmurs. Shock, disbelief, concern. Phones buzzed as messages were quietly exchanged. At that moment, the door opened again. Elise stepped in. She was dressed for court, not a boardroom, and her expression was unreadable. "I thought you should know," she said evenly. "A story will run at noon." I gave them everything, documents, recordings, eyewitness accounts, including Ernest's threats. "The media knows. So do the authorities." Ernest paled. "You think you're heroes," he spat. "You think anyone will believe this twisted story?" Jordan met his gaze without flinching. "They don't have to believe it. They just have to see it." A junior executive, confused but emboldened by the tension, hesitated before asking, "But if your family, how is it that you—" He stopped, embarrassed, unsure how to ask what he meant. Ava understood. She stepped forward gently. "You want to know why my children look different," she said softly. "Why one has skin like mine and the other does not. The room was silent, because I lived a life that had chapters. Jordan was born first from a man whose power outweighed his compassion. He was white. Imani came later from love, from a man who gave without taking. He was black. They share no father, but they share me. And that makes them brother and sister in every way that counts. No one spoke. No one could. Ava looked once more at Ernest. You thought power was enough, but truth is heavier. It outlasts your buildings, your fortune, and it brought us back to each other. Imani took her mother's hand. Jordan did the same. We are not your secret anymore, Jordan said. We are not your lie. The three of them walked out together. Behind them, the room erupted voices, questions, panic. But none of it mattered. They had said what they came to say. And now the world would hear it too. On the steps outside, the wind picked up. Reporters waited with cameras. Jordan looked at his mother. She gave a quiet nod. When he spoke, he didn't speak as a Brooks. He spoke as Jordan Reed. And for the first time, the name felt real. The morning broke quiet, the kind of silence that came not from peace, but from the world holding its breath. Outside Brooks Global headquarters, the street buzzed with tension. News vans formed a line down the block, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky. Cameramen adjusted focus. Reporters rehearsed lines, lips tight with urgency. The city had heard the story overnight, a story of power abused, of land stolen, of a mother imprisoned and erased. And now the cameras waited to capture the moment when the man behind it all would no longer be above the law. Inside the building, the glass elevators glinted with sunrise as a group of federal officers moved briskly through the lobby. No alarms, no spectacle, just quiet intent. When they reached the executive floor, the receptionist had already stepped aside. Ernest Brooks stood at the window of his corner office, back straight, hands folded. He didn't resist when they entered. He didn't speak. He only turned, blinked once at the badge, and allowed the cuffs to be placed around his wrists. He walked out with the same posture he'd always carried, spine straight, shoulders high, but without the illusion of invincibility. The cameras caught everything. At home, in a modest living room filled with sunlight and the scent of chamomile tea, Ava Reed sat on the edge of a sofa, hands clasped. She wasn't watching the news for spectacle. She didn't flinch when Ernest appeared on screen, flanked by officers escorted into the back of a black vehicle. Her fingers tightened slightly, her breath steady. Imani sat beside her silent, watching her mother more than the broadcast. Ava exhaled slowly. It's not vengeance, she said softly, almost to herself. It's justice, finally. Across town, Jordan stood behind a podium facing dozens of microphones and hundreds of eyes. The press conference had drawn local and national attention. Behind him was not the Brooks crest, but a plain white backdrop with the words Olivia Foundation Truthland Justice. He wore no designer pin, no branded suit. Just a dark shirt and a calm expression that betrayed no fear. He leaned forward slightly, speaking not with outrage, but with gravity. My name is Jordan Reed. I was once known as Jordan Brooks, son of Ernest Brooks, heir to the Brooks legacy. But that story, like many others, was a lie. The silence in the room was electric. I was taken from my mother, Ava Reed, under the pretense that she was unfit, unstable. She was neither. She was a woman who stood in the way of greed. My sister Imani was hidden for her protection, and I was raised in the shell of a family built on theft, conditioned to inherit a business built on land that was never ours. He paused, eyes sweeping the room. But I know who I am now, and that name Reed is not just mine. It's my mother's. It's my sister's. It's the name that was buried. Today, I reclaim it. He unfolded a single sheet of paper, held it briefly, then set it down. As of this morning, I have fully resigned from all Brooks Holdings operations. I have relinquished all rights, shares, and claims to the company. I will not inherit a stolen empire. I will not be the face of a lie. He gestured toward a second folder. The land formerly known as Cedar Hill, acquired through coercion and fraud, will be returned to the Reed family. And from it, we will build something honest, something that serves people, not power. The flashes from cameras intensified, but Jordan didn't blink. We are launching the Olivia Foundation. It will work toward land restoration, community healing, and justice for those who have been displaced, silenced, or forgotten. This isn't just about the past. It's about changing how we move forward. A reporter stood and called out Jordan. Why come forward now? After all these years, Jordan's voice was quiet but unshakable. Because truth takes time. And because I finally saw what was missing the family I never knew, the people who gave me my beginning. Everything I built in the name of Brooks was borrowed, but what I build from here will be mine. and I want it rooted in truth. Another question came about legal consequences about shareholders. Jordan answered each with clarity, not as a businessman defending an asset, but as a man laying down a burden he'd carried since birth. Outside the building, as he stepped down from the stage, the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. There was only stillness, then a ripple of nods, quiet claps and acknowledgement, not of performance, but of courage. Later that evening, in the quiet of the Reed family home, Imani sat on the porch steps with a notebook in her lap. Ava tended to a small herb garden by the fence, her hands deep in the soil she once thought she'd never see again. Jordan emerged from the house, 2 cups of tea in hand. He handed one to Ava, who took it without a word and looked up at the softening sky. "Do you think it's over?" Imani asked quietly. Ava shook her head. "No, but the silence is." Jordan sat beside his sister. "He'll face the courts now, but we've already done what matters most. We've spoken. We've been seen." Imani smiled faintly, "And we did it together." Inside, the television played softly. The anchor's voice filled the background, detailing the charges against Ernest, the timeline of deceit, the words Olivia Foundation now trending across networks. But no one listened closely. They didn't need to. The world could catch up in its own time. For now, they were just a mother and her children sitting beneath a fading sky, reclaiming a peace they'd been denied too long. And in that stillness, as dusk wrapped around the porch like an old blanket, Jordan whispered aloud, not for the cameras, not for the press, but for the child he once was. "I'm home." The land hadn't changed much, not on the surface. The same hills rolled quietly under the sky. The same red clay clung to boots. The same oak trees stood watch like elders who remembered everything. But for Ava, Jordan, and Imani, everything was different. The land had been returned, not just in name, but in spirit. For the first time in decades, it belonged to them again. Not as property, but as promise. They arrived early that morning with Xavier, who stood beside the rusted gate in silence, his eyes sweeping over the fields like a man remembering every step he'd once taken. "She's still here," he murmured, laying a hand on the wooden post. Buried but not broken, the farmhouse stood in the distance, weary from time but not beyond hope. Its roof sagged in places, the windows clouded with dust, but its bones were strong. Ava walked ahead, her footsteps slow but sure. She hadn't seen this home since she was forced out of it. Back then, her hands had held 2 babies, and her heart had held more fear than she could name. Now, her hands were empty, but her heart was steady. Inside, the light filtered through tattered curtains, casting long, soft shadows on the floorboards. Ava ran her fingers along the frame of a broken rocking chair, the air thick with old memories. "This is where I sang to him," she said, nodding toward Jordan. "And over there," she pointed toward the back wall, "was the cradle I carved for her. Before they took it all." Jordan knelt and lifted a fallen picture frame, brushing away dust. The photo inside had faded to sepia, but the faces his mother, a younger Xavier, and a child that could have been either of them remained. "We'll bring it back," he said. "All of it. The land, the house, the truth." And so the work began. Over the following weeks, volunteers from nearby towns trickled in. Some came because they remembered Ava. Others came because they had heard the story and wanted to help make it right. Carpenters, gardeners, teachers, and former Brooks employees, now jobless but no longer loyal to the lie, joined them with tools, with food, with hands willing to build. The Oliva Center was born not in a boardroom, but in the soil. It began with a single classroom in the refurbished barn where Imani taught young women to repair engines. She stood before them in coveralls, sleeves rolled up, grease on her palms, her voice sure and direct. "This isn't about fixing cars," she told them. "It's about building something no one can take from you." Children gathered under the old oak, now cleared of its dead limbs, its branches hung with wind chimes made from scrap metal and glass. Ava led reading circles there, her voice warm, patient, the way it had once been in lullabies. The children sat cross-legged, some barefoot, their eyes wide. For many, this was the first time they had seen a woman like her, gentle, black, strong, and leading with story instead of fear. Jordan managed the logistics not from behind a desk, but on the ground. He took calls under trees, drafted policy, while seated on crates, met with donors in folding chairs. When reporters asked why he didn't rebuild an office tower, he simply said, "Because I'm done standing above people." The name Olivia, born from Olive and Ava, spread fast. The foundation partnered with local schools, restored clean water access, and began reclaiming neighboring lots left abandoned by the Brooks Corporation. Elise helped quietly from a distance, coordinating media coverage, filtering funding offers. She never tried to reclaim a personal stake. Her apology had been clear: I came from power, but I stay for the truth. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Ava stood on the porch of the now-restored farmhouse, watching the day's light spill over the valley like honey. The house had been painted white again, the porch railings mended, the rocking chair reupholstered in blue. Xavier joined her, handing over a cup of tea. "It's not what it was," he said, "but maybe it's what it was always meant to be." She nodded, eyes misty. "We lost years, but not the root, and that's why we're still here." In the barn, Imani wiped her hands on a rag, laughing with two students who had just completed their first engine rebuild. One was a 17-year-old girl who had never known her father, the other a boy who dropped out of school the year before. "You've got it," Imani said, voice firm. "Don't ever let anyone tell you what your hands can't do." At the edge of the property, Jordan stood by a newly installed fence, watching as a truck delivered saplings, native trees, to replant the grove that had once lined the creek. A boy approached him, no more than 8 eyes, squinting under a too big cap. "Mr. Jordan?" he asked. Jordan knelt. "Yeah, is it true you used to be rich?" Jordan smiled, slow and thoughtful. "I was surrounded by money, but I wasn't rich. Not like this." He gestured to the land, the barn, the children laughing under the tree. "This is wealth, the kind that grows." The boy nodded, as if understanding something deeper than his age should allow. By nightfall, the Olivia Center glowed with strings of soft lights, laughter echoing across the fields. Dinners were held outside on long wooden tables. Elders told stories. Children danced in the grass. And amid it all, Ava Jordan and Imani sat side by side, their silhouettes joined like pieces of a puzzle finally fitted into place. No speeches were made, no plaques unveiled. Only the quiet agreement between them that all of this was not the end of a story, but the healing of one. A story that had once been torn apart by greed and silence, now stitched together again with truth, labor, and love. And though the land still held scars, patches where the soil needed rest places, where roots had been burned, there was life returning. You could see it in the green shoots pushing through the earth, in the hands reaching out to plant them, in the people who had chosen to stay not because they were told to, but because they believed again. Because home, they had learned, was not something you inherit. It's something you build, together. Spring arrived softly in Aurora, not with the sudden burst of color that some years brought, but with a patient unfolding. The hills greened gently, as if waking slowly from a long-held breath. Dogwoods bloomed like quiet promises. Birds returned in pairs, building nests in the hollows of the great oak tree that had once shaded sorrow and now cradled laughter. 1 year had passed since the day Ava Jordan and Imani stood before the world and named their truth. 1 year since the land had been returned, and a new legacy had begun, not in boardrooms or profit margins, but in sweat, soil, and soul. The Olivia Center had become more than anyone imagined. What started with a single classroom and a half-repaired barn had blossomed into a sanctuary of learning, healing, and rooted hope. The water that ran through the land, once exploited in secrecy, now fed the gardens that nourished the community. A small clinic stood beside the greenhouse. Workshops buzzed with life, and every corner of the land echoed not just with work, but with care. On a golden afternoon in April, they gathered beneath the old oak again. Ava sat in a woven chair, her posture regal, yet relaxed, her silver hair pinned in place with a carved wooden comb. Jordan and Imani stood at her side, a wide cedar table in front of them, spread with food, flowers, and photographs of people whose hands had helped shape this rebirth. It was not an anniversary celebration, no one called it that, but they had come to remember, to mark, and most of all, to plant. In her hands, Ava held a small sapling no more than 2 feet tall, its roots wrapped in burlap. She rose slowly and walked to the clearing beside the oak, where a circle of stones had been laid earlier that morning. The crowd quieted. No speech was needed, just the sound of the shovel striking earth. Jordan dug the hole, Imani lowered the tree, and Ava placed a final scoop of soil over its roots. Beside it, a polished plaque was placed into the ground. It read, "Truth will always find its way home." A child raised his hand from the front row. He couldn't have been more than 7, with a cap slightly askew and a voice filled with innocent curiosity. "Miss Ava," he asked gently, "how come your children don't look like twins if they're from the same mama?" Laughter stirred gently in the crowd, but Ava knelt beside the boy with the same care she gave every answer. "Because love writes stories in every shade," she said, "and sometimes families are made of many colors. But what binds them isn't what you see, it's what they carry." The boy nodded, solemnly satisfied with the answer in a way only children could be. And with that, the moment passed, not as a lesson, but as truth spoken simply. The evening unfolded in waves. Music played from old speakers rigged to a generator. Elder women passed down recipes in paper-bound cookbooks. Teens taught younger kids to dance in the dirt. Ava moved among them like a living blessing. Jordan shared stories with young men learning to carve wood. Imani leaned against the tool shed, arms crossed, watching her students take charge of repairing a tractor she once thought unsalvageable. Later that night, when the lanterns glowed and the stars blinked awake above them, the three of them sat together again beneath the tree. Jordan reached into a small box and pulled out a carved wooden bird, the one Imani had given him as a child, once lost, now found again. He placed it at the base of the new tree beneath the plaque. "Full circle," he said softly. Imani nodded, but not closed, just beginning again. Ava smiled, her fingers brushing the bark of the new tree. "This one will outlive us," she said, "and when it's tall, someone will sit under it and remember what was planted here, not just the tree, but the truth." The air around them was still, but not heavy. It was the stillness of something held honored. Jordan looked out at the people dancing, eating, laughing under string lights that swayed gently in the breeze. There was no logo here, no brand, only names spoken in gratitude, only hands offered in work, only hearts allowed to rest. "I used to think legacy was what you left behind," he said, "but now I think it's what you build while you're still here, one root at a time." Imani leaned her head against his shoulder, "And built right it holds." Above them the stars blinked, and somewhere in the trees a bird sang. Not a cry, not a call, just a song that had always been there, waiting for the quiet to return. And in that quiet, surrounded by all they had restored, the family that had once been torn apart by silence sat together beneath the open sky. The past had been faced, the lies had been laid to rest, and the future unwritten, uncertain, but theirs had finally tenderly begun.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.